And one of the things that I want to kind of always like to go back to the beginning. And it's by my understanding, you discovered photography when you were 20. And I kind of want to go back in those days, and you can tell me a little bit about what was the trigger, what was the thing that made you pursue photography?
Yeah, when I finished high school, I didn't quite know what I wanted to do. A friend of mine mentioned a photo school in Berlin. I was living in Frankfurt at that point, and he said, "Why don't you apply with me for this photography school?" And I was hesitant because I said, "I've never taken a picture in my life. I'm not a photographer. Photographers are always the ones that are kind of, it's voyeuristic. They come into moments when I organize a party and I finally get some people drunk. The photographers come in, the school photographers, and ruin the moment, make everybody feel uncomfortable." But then I had no better idea, so I applied for this photo school. I had to take some pictures for the application. In the end, they accepted me and not my friend. And he was very good already. So I thought maybe I have a talent in photography. And yeah, and I went to this photo school in Berlin.
Was the photography school as what you thought would it be?
It was very, yeah, it wasn't very artistic. It was more old school, almost like apprenticeship feeling, you know, a lot of chemistry and math classes. It was really organized more like a school. A lot of emphasis on black and white printing, color printing in dark rooms. Yeah, it was the days before computers. Nobody even had a laptop, or nobody had a cell phone. We're talking 1990. That's how old I am. So it was very technical, and in retrospect, I think that was great because it enabled me to kind of do anything in photography and not have to think about technical aspect of it, and to focus now more on content and the artistic approach to photography.
Is that something that is still taught in schools today? Because, as you mentioned before, technology has gone so far. Those technical aspects, it's something that's still around, that's important for like an upcoming photographer. Do you believe so?
I think it's changed dramatically. The technical aspects are different now. You know, for professional photographers, so many softwares are important, from Photoshop to how to store your images, capture software. So the technical becomes more, yeah, it's not so much about choices of lenses anymore. So many photographers use very similar cameras. There's less range of cameras than there used to be. And so the technical aspect is still there. I think nowadays, you know, you can take a great picture with your phone. You might not have the very best quality, but the quality is already pretty good. And the focus is more on content, on what you photograph and how you photograph it. The one thing that has not changed is lighting, you know, and I think that's a quintessential point. You know, an old word for photography is light painting, meaning, you know, it's all about the light in photography, and that is something that I wish many photo schools would work more on. A lot of young people that come here to work with me, they don't seem to have much of an idea on how to set up lights, how to work light, how to see light, how to analyze daylight, and how to make the best use of it.
What about lighting that you think perhaps is underrated?
I think, you know, it depends on what your goal is, what kind of, you know, I going forward, I think it's more important as a photographer to see themselves as storytellers. My job that I have been doing now for almost 30 years doesn't exist anymore. You know, there isn't, I was a classic magazine photographer. I wanted to be in the footsteps of Richard Avedon or Irving Penn, Annie Leibovitz, getting assignments from magazines. And then trying to take pictures in that setting that have a life also in museums and galleries, and go beyond the use for the magazines. But magazines are basically, yeah, gone, unfortunately, for the most part. Nobody's buying magazines anymore. So that kind of photography doesn't exist anymore. So now it's shifted a lot more towards video. People basically publishing their own magazines online on Instagram. You know, everybody has become a publisher, so to speak. You don't need anyone else to show your work to the world. You can do it yourself. So there's been a lot of changes, but ultimately, if you have good ideas and you have a strong vision and have a story to tell, I think that will always survive.
Do you believe, at least for your industry, social media, let's perhaps use Instagram as an example, was a good thing? Or, and the fact that now, as you mentioned earlier as well, that everybody has a decent camera on their pockets all over the world and they can take pictures of any time and any moment.
Hmm.
What are your overall, looking back at 15 years now of a smartphone, 10 years of social media, whatever, how long it is, how is that really transforming not only, the social aspect that we're living in, but also your industry?
Well, it definitely ruined my industry. Everybody is a photographer now, which is great in the sense that I think a lot of people have discovered for themselves the joy of photography and they enjoy taking pictures and they're thinking more about taking picture and about what a good picture is like. It basically has turned so many people into amateur photographers, which is great because I love photography myself. But for professional working photographers, it's obviously become more difficult.
I want to go back a little bit on your early days in school because you were in school in Germany in the 90s, early 90s, I believe, in 1990, you said. And that's the time, was a very important time in Germany. Right? The walls has come down. Berlin's experienced this a cultural explosion that has vibrant art city has become. What was it like to be there in those days? What did the city look like? What are the things that you were interested in and what was happening in the city?
Yeah, I started school in '89, so I just had started school when the wall came down in November of '89. And it was very exciting. Nobody would have thought that to be possible. I had friends in East Germany. I used to go to East Germany many times before the wall came down. All of a sudden, uh, the wall was gone. It was unfathomable. I was there at night when the first people came across the border and tears in their eyes. People were crying. Unfortunately, I failed as a photographer. I don't have any great pictures, even so I was right there. It was very difficult to photograph because it was dark. So you could only take like pictures with a strobe. So you could only photograph really what's right in front of you. Film wasn't as light sensitive as digital cameras are now. It was really hard to photograph in a pitch black night. And it all happened so fast, and it was just but it was very emotional, but very hard to document. And yeah, being young and in the city that was changing so dramatically overnight, it was very exciting.
Like being going back to there and being that and immediately being in school, have those conversations with your classmates, with the teachers. With now the world has opened up to the city, all the possibilities are possible, anything is possible. Do you remember one thing specific that you thought, oh, now we're gonna be able to do this, that perhaps was a problem before?
No, because I grew up in the West, so we had all the freedoms, that anyone growing up in the Western world has, being able to travel, being able to choose where you want to live, what you want to do, what you want to study. I think it was a huge change for people growing up in East Germany, where it was very restricted. You couldn't travel freely, you couldn't necessarily study what you wanted to what study, and for those people, it was like a huge change overnight. For me, it was more strange. I had to go through all these checkpoints to go visit my friend, and they were always afraid of the government, and they were always afraid of being spied upon. And now, for them, it was overwhelming for some.
No, I believe. Can you only imagine? Out of suddenly overnight, things just
Mm,
became the whole. Literally, the wall went down. You can just cross it and do whatever you want. What a
yeah.
transformation! What a sense of freedom must be.
I mean, I have one friend, Harald Hauswald. He took me a little bit under his wings. I had met him in Leipzig during a book fair. A little older than me, he just turned 70, and he later saw his Stasi Aktien, his Secret Service reports that were done on him because he had some Western friends, and he realized that one out of three of his friends was writing reports about him. You know, spying on him. So everybody was spying on each other almost. It was similar to the Nazi times when everybody was ratting each other out and to constantly look over your shoulder.
Yeah. And right after that, I believe you decided to go to New York. I believe, correct if I'm wrong, 92, 93? Is that about?
Yeah, I after school I worked as an intern and an assistant for different German photographers and realized how much work it is to be an assistant for a photographer, 14-hour days, with 21 years old. You're like, oh my God, I really have to work that much. It was it was a little shock, and I came to the conclusion that I should, if I realized how much I can learn from a working photographer, how much I can grow, and how much there is to know more. But I thought I should at least work for somebody whose work I really admire. Working so hard for somebody whose work is not that great, I felt like a waste of time. So on the top of my list was Irving Penn. And
Uh-huh.
then back then, I thought maybe I can do fashion. So there was Stephen Meisel and Annie Leibovitz. So they were all in New York. My English was horrible, and I just came to New York in 1992. I didn't know anyone. I called them all up, sent out like resumes. I didn't hear anything, and I had to go back to Germany. Worked as a bartender, and also worked with handicapped men, taking care of two handicapped men had multiple sclerosis, and saved up some money, and then came back in '93 and ended up being able to work with Annie Leibovitz and stayed there for 3 years.
Now, an important question. As a bartender, what's your favorite drink, and what was you very good at it? What was the most requested drink at the bar?
It's Germany, so beer. you know,
Keep it
I think,
simple.
yeah, I think beer. It was the bar was open till 4 in the morning, and then people would switch over to other drinks. But in Germany, I think number one drink is beer all around.
So now you go back to New York, and you working with Annie, and you've been able to, I think you worked with her for a few years, if I'm not
Hmm.
mistaken, and you have spoken about it in length, things that you learn, inspiration, and all of that. But eventually you move on to do your own thing. Is that a specific thing that you wanted to do differently than her? That you did not want to do, instead of finding inspiration and kind of copying a model, you wanted to do something different than what she was doing?
No, I really thought like she had the perfect career in my from I aspired to have her career, working for magazines, and photographing famous people for the most part, traveling the world, doing ad jobs on the side to make money. And then she had gallery shows and books. I thought, I wanted to do the same thing she was doing, basically. I want to treat people a little bit nicer, maybe, but other than that, um, that was kind of the ideal, yeah, career she had, or she still has.
I'm always fascinated when I talk to creative people about the courage that takes to move forward. As you mentioned, you decided you needed to go to New York. You sent emails, not emails back then, so a letter, and you call, and you have all those little things that wasn't quite working out. So, at what point that you develop the confidence to kind of really pursue those bigger projects and to really go after and move to a different country to pursue that?
Yeah, I think coming from Germany is not as hard to immigrate because you can always go back. Germany, I could have worked there, and I had a safe place to go back to with a good social system in place, and not as hard to immigrate from Germany than from some places where you can't go back to. So yes, it was kind of courageous. I came to New York. I didn't know one single person. I was all by myself. And but it was also I found it like extremely exciting, the freedom that it gives you to be on your own and the challenge. And
Was
I fell in love with New York. I walked the street for hours, for days. I'm so happy to be here.
That's what I was going to ask you about. It was New York exactly what I thought it would be?
Yeah, I thought it was even more exciting than I thought it would be. It was so many different people. It felt, back then it was slightly dangerous. Some neighborhoods were more edgy than they're now. It was dirty. It was wild. It was, the nightlife was crazy, and the people were so much more colorful than in Germany. It was, yeah, in Germany everything was a lot more, going along the same kind of lines, more regulated, and here it was yeah, more full of life, more energy.
So outside working 14 hours a day, what else were you doing in the mid 90s in New York on the weekends, your time off? What are you exploring? How were you kind of, sucked in the city and really developing your sense of becoming a New Yorker, perhaps?
I would, on the weekends, I would do my own photo shoots. I would organize, I would photograph friends. I would try to implement what I learned working with Annie, do lighting tests, try to copy the lighting I did for her, photographing back then some models, testing models for agencies, and photographing people I would meet on the street, asking them to photograph them. Knowing that I will need a portfolio one day, that I need to have some work to show, and that's when I kind of developed my style of photographing everybody very straight on. I kind of documented all my friends at that time. I had met somebody who had a studio, so he would let me use a studio sometimes at night for free, and I would invite friends, buy a couple of beers, and torture them all night. So that was kind of my time off. Of course, I went to some clubs and bars.
Now, one thing that visiting a lot of your work recently and being able to look, you have this striking, it's very intimate. There's a sense of vulnerability. And I love how a lot of times you have said this before, you kind of strip away everything else from the environment, like the clothing, anything that can give it away, their background, in terms of social class, so you can really pay attention to the element, the person, the subject in front of you. Would you say early in those days at nights with friends over beer and really trying different lenses, you started developing this kind of style, kind of understanding your own vision and your own perspective, how you wanted your art to be prevailed?
Yeah, I didn't, I think I hear so many people planning their careers and talking about, I didn't plan much. I just took pictures and then see where it would take me. I was very impressed by Bernd and Hilla Becher, this German photography art couple that had photographed water towers and different details of industrial structures, all in the exact same style. And this idea of cataloging maybe is a very German approach, but what I loved about their work is that they kind of try to be objective in their photography, in a sense that they looked for very flat lighting. Every water tower they photographed from the same angle and the same light. And it was just all about this one water tower front and center. And I kind of tried to translate their work into portraits, which in the beginning turned to be very static. I brought out this large format camera, an 8 by 10 inch camera. Nobody was allowed to smile. Nobody was allowed to wear any clothes. Everybody had to pull their hair back. And that was my first portfolio. It was very cold and almost clinical. So I think magazines kind of didn't know what to do with those kind of portraits. It didn't translate to magazine assignments. And then later I loosened it up, and I've been doing these portraits now with a medium format camera, which allows for more expressions, for faster workflow, and change my lighting to something that really brings out the eyes, it illuminates, and a very shallow depth of field. So the pictures all become about the eyes and the lips, and everything else kind of falls off. It also helped, when I started out after I left Annie, like 97, was a hype of these very elaborate setups. David LaChapelle was a huge star. He had like 40 people in his pictures and crazy lighting setup and a lot of energy, a lot of clothes. These like very interesting characters. Oftentimes Annie always had the most beautiful locations, the most beautiful clothes, perfect hair and makeup. Everything was always like perfect, perfect, perfect. Starting out, I couldn't compete with that. I didn't have the clothes. I didn't have the locations. So it would have been very hard for me to step into that world from the get-go. So I think these close-up portraits were fairly easy to do from a technical point of view, from a production point of view. And in the beginning, magazine editors they kind of liked them, but they didn't quite see it, how it would work in their magazine. It took about 2 years after I left Annie for a magazine editor to give me an assignment to photograph Vanessa Redgrave. And, I only had friends in my portfolio, nobody famous. So finally I had the opportunity to photograph Vanessa Redgrave for like 15 minutes during a press junket. And everybody loved the picture. By then, slightly older woman. She looked great. The lighting is very flat and kind of barely see any wrinkles. And then it was like an avalanche. I photographed some weddings, I photographed some still lifes to make a living in '98. I had a few little jobs here and there, but then in 1999, so I went from let's say 10 jobs to 127 jobs in 1999, and
Wow.
everybody wanted close-up portraits because they were the perfect counterbalance to what
Mhm.
everybody else was doing. They were the opposite from what everybody else was doing, and they looked good in magazines because they had the very elaborate, and then it's like almost having a movie and you need a break. You need something surprising in a magazine. Close-ups were a good fit for many.
What was going through your mind when you went, as you mentioned, to a few jobs happening every year to 100 plus? Did you eventually came up with the idea, oh, I made it. I have achieved my goal. Here we are.
I still don't think I made it. If you lean back and think like you made it, then I'm always afraid of that feeling because then it implies that you try less hard going forward. You got to remind yourself to stay hungry and try your best every time for every job. I think it's very quintessential, but it was just very exhilarating, after so many years of struggling, of working very hard as an assistant. I went through years where I gave myself a spending limit of $10 a day. I would ride the city around on rollerblades, so didn't have to buy subway tokens. I had to save the money for subway tokens. I would hold on to trucks sometimes for long stretches of avenues to drop off my portfolios. I spent every single penny I had on my photography, and then all of a sudden you have all these jobs. It was like overwhelming, but so very exciting. And I only slept for maybe 4 hours a night for many years, but I didn't mind because it's what I wanted.
That's an interesting thing when you talk about a little bit of the struggles and all the things that you had to do to overcome. Was there at any point in those days that you look at yourself and you go, perhaps this is not for me. Perhaps it's not going to work out.
I never had a backup plan. I never knew what else I could do, should do, would do. I guess if it didn't work out, I would have gone back to Germany at some point. But yeah, at one point I was so broke that I thought maybe I should drive cabs on the side. But then it was very hard to get a taxi license back in the days. You had to learn the city for inside out. It was before GPS. No, I never thought I should be doing anything else.
Do you think that's a must have feeling for people pursuing artistic careers? Is that almost like there's no plan B, there's only plan A?
Yeah, I think at least, yeah, I think that's it's so hard to make a living in this field, in this world, and it's become a lot harder now than it was back in my days. There was so many magazines, photographers, so many photographers working for all these hundreds of different magazines. So now with AI coming into the playing field and probably photographs being generated artificially, it's another big upset in my world. You have to be very stubborn. You have to really be like, this is what I want to do. I have no backup plan. And you have to be kind of flexible too, in a sense that, maybe you do more video or maybe you incorporate some writing in your work. I think for anyone who wants to have a career like me, they have to think about themselves as I have something important that I want to share, something intimate that ties into my personality, and how can I best tell my story? And it might be through photographs, or it might be through photographs and video, or whatever kind of medium one might find.
You did said earlier in a conversation that you see yourself as a storytelling more than anything else. Are there other specific mediums that you considered being involved in using to tell your stories beyond photography?
Yeah, I had a show here at the Photographic in New York with a video installation where it kind of translated my portraits into video. I call them moving portraits, where I would film people in my close-up setup style and interview the people. So I never liked watching people talk. You always look at the mouth, and it's never that flattering, and you don't really get to see the person because you're just focusing on listening to them. So yeah, it's basically portraits, moving portraits with a voiceover. It was an installation I did with death row exonerees at Photographic that I'm very proud of. Yeah, so I still love books and still photography is still my where my heart is at. But you know, you have to mix things up.
And that's an interesting thing because you have such a clear, specific style that you're very well known for. Do you find yourself sometimes wanting to kind of walk away from it, or just enhance and keep improving and crafting even further that specific style? Where do you lay in terms of interests right now?
Well, these close-up portraits started doing them in '97, so I feel like I'm stuck with them. I think I should keep
For
on,
better or worse?
for better or worse. You know, I consider building this catalog of faces. I see myself also as a documentarian of our time. You know, that's one of the things I do. And then besides series, I still use an 8x10 inch camera, which is like a huge format sheet film camera, large format camera. For personal projects, I just did a series on drag queens, but I've also photographed female bodybuilders with that camera, or religious leaders in New York City with that camera. And going forward, I want to go back to photographing indigenous groups, especially hunter-gatherer tribes. I've photographed some of them before, so I want to revisit them. And you know, that's more journalistic work. My heart. I started more as a journalistic photographer in the very beginning, and that's still it gives me great joy just to wake up with a camera and document life around me without setting anything up, without publicists, without anyone telling me what to do. It's just me and the camera in the jungle.
That's a beautiful image to picture as well. What are some of the things that you have learned from your subject? Any specific one that can come to mind that once you photograph subject with this series that transform your life, not only professionally, but really personally?
I don't think one person necessarily stands out, but I think we're all a lot more similar than we would want to admit. You know, I think everybody gets stuck in their own world and thinks of themselves as being very special and very unique. Having met so many different people, also very famous and successful and rich people, I don't think they're necessarily happier than people that have a lot less. You know, I think money and fame don't equate happiness. We all share the same fears and anxiety about knowing that we will all die, that you can't take anything with you, that fame can be very temporary, and that, we all share the same kind of humanity and everything that comes with it.
Talk about humanity. You said before too that 50% of subjects enjoy the final result, but the other 50 kind of, say, oh my goodness, I see my wrinkles, why so close, has some sort of hesitation. What about the human nature to kind of obsess or fixate over the negative aspect of ourselves instead of perhaps the positive one? Do you see that common denominator in a lot of the subjects or people overall that you engage in a daily basis?
Yeah, I think we're all more vain than we like to admit. And people that, oh, I don't care what I look like, and then they see a close-up portrait of them, like, well, I don't look that great in that one, you know. Well, you said you don't really care what you look like. So where vanity runs deep, and even the people that pretend to be not vain are more vain than they want to admit. And once they are confronted with a close-up portrait, oftentimes because they're so honest and so direct, that, you know, with my portraits, people that have very symmetrical faces oftentimes look better, or people like themselves more. And then people that, you know, have not so symmetrical faces, they tend to turn their head a certain way. They know which way they look the best. The left side is better than the right side. So when they're photographed straight on, then they sometimes are not that pleased with the results. You know, that's part of that's my style. I treat everybody the same. I photograph everybody in the same angle, and people have to live with it. It's like,
C'est la vie.
c'est la vie.
I want to ask a couple of rapid fire questions to you, and then have a sense of fun with this conversation. A lot of hypotheticals here, so let's start. If you could have a dinner with 3 people, it could be living, dead, anybody in history, who would it be?
Could I photograph them while having dinner?
Sure.
Okay. Well, I wish I would have photographed Nelson Mandela. Really bummed out. I tried for years and years to photograph him. Gandhi, why not? And maybe Jesus, you know.
Put all the spiritual leaders together and
Yeah,
see what we get out of it.
yeah.
I love it. If you could, if you could overnight become an expert on a subject, what would it be?
Expert on the subject. I would love to be a really good pianist.
Did you ever take lessons?
Yeah, a little bit, but it's so time consuming. And
I know.
but it would be great to be good at an instrument, or it could be cello, the piano. But to be really good at playing an instrument would be great.
Do you normally play music while you're shooting?
I always play music. Yeah,
And the music will vary depend on the subject, or you usually
it
have a.
depends on the subject. I try to think about what they might like, what might put them at ease. Portrait photography is all about distracting people while you photograph them to make them forget that they're being photographed. So they behave more like themselves, and you capture facial expressions that are not pre-studied. We all have our facial expressions incorporated, that we kind of want to share. And especially when we're being photographed, oftentimes people make certain faces that they think are good, because they want to convey a specific mood. So it's you have to break through that and make people forget that they're being photographed. So music helps, and I constantly talk to the people I photograph. I think it's very important to have a constant dialogue, conversation.
What's the most courageous thing you ever done?
The most courageous thing I've ever done. Maybe come to New York by myself. Yeah, probably. But it's like many times my pictures, have to really be quite pushy and quite talk people into doing things that they might not necessarily want to do. I photographed Bill Clinton at the White House, so I took some golf clubs with me and put them between the light stands. And towards the end of my time with him, I pulled out a golf club and said, "Hey, Mr. President, would you mind hitting some golf balls in the White House?" And his press secretary almost had a heart attack.
How dare you?
How dare you? What? But President Clinton did it nevertheless. So, or I just wrapped some gaffer's tape or some scotch tape around Steve Carell's face without much heads up. So you have to, yeah. But it's courageous. But on the other hand, they can also say no, and then it doesn't.
But you have to know not to take it personal either, right? If you're going out there and trying something new, being courageous with your options, the no is kind of a possibility.
Oh yeah, it happens all the time. Most of the time I hear a no. That's the problem.
What is the most important quality in a friend?
Loyalty.
Another one I was going to ask, I guess, you already I was going to say, if you could witness any event in the past, present, or future, what would it be?
If I could what? If I could witness.
If you could witness any event in history, in the past, present, or future, what would it be? I mean, you already kind of witnessed a big one with the fall of the Berlin Wall, but there's any other event in history, or perhaps
so many events. I wish, I wish I could step back in time and just see what people lived like, the Egyptians, or I think it's hard. People easily romanticize past times. I think most people forget that 95% of people 200-300 years ago were pretty miserable.
Yes.
And we only see TV shows about the very few rich ones that exploited those poor people. But I would love to, if I could go back and hang out with the Incas, or the Aztecs. That would be amazing.
If you could change one thing about yourself, what would it be?
God, I'm not that perfect, so let me see. Maybe be nicer to myself. I think I'm a little too hard on myself sometimes.
You're too hard on yourself in terms of too critical of your work?
Too critical, maybe, yeah.
What are you doing to get there? What are the things that you're implementing, new things, so you can try to accomplish that?
No, just no. I mean, it's not so dramatic that, but sometimes I wish I was a little bit more like, more at ease with myself. I think a lot of people can share that sentiment that, it's hard to just be like, okay, it's fine.
Yeah,
let things go.
Absolutely. No, I know what you're talking about. What's the best compliment you ever got?
Oh, I did a fundraiser for this organization that's made up of death row exonerees, and the chairman said a lot of nice things about me, and that really made me cry. He is somebody who spent 27 years in prison.
Wow.
Story I shared, and him like being so touched by my work.
Martin, there's three questions I ask everybody here in the show. And one of them is to recommend us a book, something to read. And then the following up would be recommend us something to watch. Could be a movie, a TV show, a documentary. And the last, a guest. Who should we invite to be here in the show next?
Oh boy. I just watched Fauda on Netflix, an Israeli show about the special forces group working in the West Bank, and I thought it gives a really good insight in that world. From what I read, is the show is also a lot of Palestinians like to see the show, so it's very timely, but also. Yeah, I think it's educational to some extent, and it's action and entertaining, and I like how it brings out the humanity on both sides, how similar really Israelis and Palestinians are physically speaking, how people can't even times tell Jewish people and Arabs apart. A book I just read, a friend of mine's book, Andrian Krai, he wrote a book about AI. That I can highly recommend. I don't know if it's available in the States yet, but I like to read up on AI and see where that might take us. What was the last
A
question?
guest. Who should we invite to
Who
be a
should you
guest?
invite? I think one of the most underrated, forgotten photographers, one of my biggest influences is Philip Lorca di Corsia. He's a photographer, he's like in the 70s now, who I think influenced my entire generation of photographers. He was the second photographer to have a color photography exhibition at the MoMA. And yeah, he's one of the all-time greats. So get him before it's too late. I think he is very
Yes, we're
inspirational.
gonna work on it. Martin, what a joy to be able to spend some time with you and open up a little bit about your story, your upbringing, and some of the more personal touch of your career. And I just want to thank you so much for joining us, taking the time. And as you mentioned earlier on before we start recording, you said, "Ask me anything. I'm an open book." And here we are,
Okay,
diving,
Yuri.
getting to know that book a little bit more. And I know there's many, many chapters still left on that book, so I'm very curious to continue, getting to know you and learn more about your work and admire you from far away.
Thank you, Yuri. Thanks so much for having me. It was fun.
Yes.